About performance obligations today. What we're going to talk about are first performance bonds, and then I've brought my uncle, David Snow, there is a relation there, to talk about alternatives to performance bonds. And I like these to be as interactive as possible, so if you have any questions, feel free to jump in right away, and we're happy to take the questions as they come. And the reason I brought David with me is he does the financial side of things, obviously, as a banker. And one of the reasons you go to law school is because you can't really do math. And so if you can save anything that has to do with math for David, he can answer those questions during his portion of the presentation. So just a little bit of a roadmap. First, we're going to talk about, as I said, performance bonds. We'll talk about some of the basic terms and the definition of what that is. And then also enforcement issues, which is the heart of what we're talking about today. And then avoiding legal pitfalls, how to avoid those problems in the first place, if possible, and if a problem does arise, how to address it and deal with it. And then I'll briefly touch on the state of the bond market, what is it like to try to get a bond these days. Finally, I'll give a Utah law update. There's been some recent changes to these matters in the Utah code, and we'll talk about that. And then at that point, I'll turn the time over to David, and he's going to talk about financial matters, avoiding financial pitfalls, and then alternatives to their performance bonds. So this is the definition from Black's Law Dictionary. A third party's agreement to guarantee the completion of a construction contract upon the default of the general contractor. You've got a safety net that the surety is supposed to be providing for the county. And it really, the first part of that is it's an agreement. It's a third party's agreement. And so it's important to keep in mind it's a legal obligation that these sureties enter into that they really are legally required to follow through on. The parties to a bond are generally the principal, which is generally the general contractor. The obligee is the county in this case, and the surety is the bonding company. If this gentleman were your general contractor, you probably would never need to call the bonds. So if you could hire this guy, then you wouldn't have to worry about this presentation. Unfortunately, our general contractor isn't always able to complete the work for various reasons. And sometimes things don't go quite as planned. This looks like a great road up to a certain point. And that's about when it ends. Sidewalk, I'm not sure how far down I'd like to go down that path, but there's a sidewalk that's not quite complete. Now, this is a Roman aqueduct, obviously, and if you look at performance bonds, these actually go back to Roman times, believe it or not. And ancient historians will tell you that this was a completed aqueduct at one point. As a trained professional, I know an incomplete improvement when I see one, and that looks incomplete to me. So I would call the bonds on that project. There's a gas pipeline, didn't quite make it. And then the fabled bridge to nowhere. All right, so now what? You've got an improvement, the developer agreed to do it, the general contractor agreed to do it, it didn't get done. You've got a surety bond in place, what do? You call the surety, right? That's why you got the bond in the first place. And that's simple. You make the phone call and you get the surety to step up. Easy enough. If only it were that easy. There's a problem that counties have and that any municipality has. And the main reason why you have difficulty getting the surety to step up, in some cases, sometimes the surety will just do it, but the main difficulty is indemnity agreements. And that's the biggest problem. And that's a behind the scenes issue that counties may not be aware of. But when a surety company issues a bond to a developer or a general contractor, the surety at the same time enters into an agreement with the general contractor or the developer to indemnify the surety. So if the surety has to pay on the bond, the surety will then turn back to the general contractor and recoup all the money from the general or the developer, whoever the bond was with. So the problem that counties have is that if there's no funding to perform on the construction contract and the work doesn't get done, there's generally no funding to reimburse the surety. And so the surety, their big hang-up, and this is again a behind-the-scenes issue that you may not be aware of from the county side, but the big hang-up that the surety has is, do they really want to spend a lot of money completing a project when they have no chance of getting that money back from the general or the developer who indemnified them? So that's an issue that you've got to be aware of, and I've got this talk to the hand kind of thing. Sometimes you get the talk to the hand response from a surety company, but sometimes they will engage with you and they'll whisper sort of sweet nothings and try to calm you down and say, don't worry, it's going to get done. And the reason for that is that generally with these bonds, you have a very short fuse. You have a 2-year fuse on the standard form agreements for performance bonds. And these bond numbers are listed here, A311 and A312. Now, my recommendation would be to try to avoid using these bond forms, unless the surety company requires it, which they might in some cases. But if you can avoid using those, the problem that counties have is these forms that generally will be provided by a surety company, they don't really fit for counties and cities. In fact, just on the front page of the surety, on the bond form, it says principal, which is the general contractor, and then owner. So generally those forms are used for situations where it's between the developer and the general contractor, guaranteed by the surety. With the county does not own the land generally with what we're discussing today. And so the county is not really the owner, so it doesn't really fit. It doesn't fit what counties are trying to do. That's just the first reason. That's not the most important reason. The next issue is that they have a very short statute of limitations period on these standard form bonds. You have 2 years generally on the newest version of the bond form, 2 years from the date that work stops, or 2 years from the date of breach, or 2 years from the date that the claim is denied. For all intents and purposes, as soon as those shovels come out of the ground, the 2-year clock starts ticking. You've got 2 years to enforce those bonds. And so it's a very short statute. And another problem with it is this. If this looks like a mess, it sort of is. This is a summary of the procedure you have to go through to call the bonds on one of these standard form AIA agreements. And even though I read legal casebooks for a living, and that's, light reading for lawyers, essentially, these bonds are not a model of clarity, we'll put it that way. And so I took a bond that I was working on and I did a summary of every step that we had to do exactly to avoid the surety company coming back and saying, oh, look, you messed up on step number 4. So this is just a summary, and if it looks pretty complicated and labyrinthine, it really is. And so when you use these standard form bonds, you're sort of subjecting the county to a host of steps and challenges that you really don't have to do. So one thing I would recommend is have the county attorney draft a custom surety bond instead. So when a developer or a general contractor comes to the county and says, we want to do this development, you can hand this form as the bond that you require to be signed by a bonding company, instead of saying you need to get a bond and letting them get whatever bond they want to get. The advantage that you have here, we have a question.
Would you have a sample of that kind of a form?
I could get you one. On the last slide, it has my email address. And I think you have a hard copy of these slides. So if you look at that, if you send me an email, I can get you a form. One advantage that you have is if you have the county attorney draft a custom agreement, the nice thing is you can craft it the way that fits the county's needs. Now, I think for most counties, it doesn't fit the county's needs to have a 2-year statute of limitations. Sometimes you don't want to call the bonds and file a lawsuit within a couple of years. You might need to give it some more time, especially where the county has a relationship with the developer or a general contractor. And so on a standard form contract in Utah, does anyone know the standard statute of limitations in Utah on a written contract?
1 year.
6 years. On a general contract, if there's no statute of limitations in the agreement, it's generally 6 years. And so it's much longer than what you get if you use one of these AIA forms where you've got 2 years. So that's a major advantage. We had a case, Bart and I actually, where there were 2 different types of bonds entered into. You had these standard Form A, 311, 312 bonds that were entered into, but the county smartly required a separate, a custom bond to be entered into as well by the bonding company and the owner of the development. And by the time Bart and I got involved, the 2-year statute was well past, and there was no chance to call that bond. But because we had a custom bond, we had a 6-year statute. So we were able to take this custom contract that the county attorney had done, and we called that bond and included that in a complaint. And we were able to settle that case with the bonding company, which before that point had not really shown any interest at all in stepping up. And it was a very favorable outcome for everyone involved. And so, at least on the county side. But so I really can't stress enough that you really don't want to be bound to just the standard form bond and all the procedures that you really don't want to have to go through. Now, some of these problems that develop later on, you can really avoid at the very beginning of trouble. If you see that there's issues in the work getting done and the infrastructure being completed, talk to the general contractor, talk to the developer, keep that line of communication open. You've got the Covey Habit 5, seek first to understand. The most important thing you can do is try to find out why the shovels have come out of the ground. And you can find out right away if there's going to be a major funding issue or if it's just something else. And then also you can talk to the surety company. There's nothing that says you can't call Travelers or whatever bonding company is involved and just let them know what you see. And I wouldn't do that in an accusatory fashion, but I would certainly just let them know, by the way, you've bonded for $6 million and for whatever reason construction has halted. I'm not sure what's going on, but I wanted to let you know just so you have something to document what's going on. Now, if you need to call the bonds, here are some issues to keep in mind, some critical issues. First, I can't stress highly enough, especially if you have the AIA bonds, you need to comply strictly with the bond procedures. And we'll talk about that in a second, exactly why that's important. But I would also counter the deadlines. If the shovels have come out of the ground, I would make a note in your calendar 2 years from that date, as close as you can pinpoint when that stopped. So you can say we've got 2 years from that point if we have to call these bonds, and hopefully not. But if we need to, we can do that. And then also there's strict notice requirements. For the AIA bonds, it specifies when notice must be given and to who, and the contents of the notice. So notice has to be given to the general contractor who stopped working and to the bonding company, and it's got to be sent to the exact right address. It's very precise and very strict, and courts pursue those bonding agreements generally fairly strictly. If notice isn't given in the right fashion to the right person at the right time, they will say, well, you agreed to follow this procedure and you didn't. And courts have been known to deny those bond calls in cases like that. Another issue is making sure that you actually are dealing with a real default. One of the defenses a surety has is that the work was substantially completed. So if the work is substantially completed, it's hard to show that there was a material breach in that case. On the other hand, if everything was completed except for, let's say, the curb and gutter, or let's say the lines on the road weren't painted yet, it's just a road, and the road's done, but there's no paint on the ground, that's sort of punch list type work. And that's the kind of thing, you don't need to call the bond for that. Courts don't really need you to invoke the action of the courts for situations like that. And the final issue to keep in mind is to cooperate. So if you try to call the bonds, you know what it's like to get a letter from one of these bonding companies within a couple of weeks. There'll be a long list of 20 or 30 items that the bonding company wants. And they'll say, well, we don't have enough information. You need to give us these documents. You need to give us this information. And if you can put someone on that and very quickly get those documents and that information back to the bonding company, that will help them and avoid issues for the county's sake by having a surety saying, look, we tried to investigate this and we couldn't get any documents, we couldn't get any information. So we denied on that basis. So what the most important advice I can give you is don't try to go it alone. I showed you that summary of what the procedure is to call the bonds, and it's a very complex and challenging process, and so get advice from the county attorney and get them involved instead of trying to proceed on your own is my recommendation. Now the surety has a few options. If the bonds are called, they can buy back the bond, they can finance the principal, they can tender a completion contractor to the obligee, the county, they can execute a takeover agreement, they can allow the obligee to mitigate or deny the claim. So the bottom line is they can either accept the claim and cause the work to be done, or pay for what the value of the work was, or deny the claim. That's essentially all the options the surety has. And they have a few defenses as well. They can say, look, that work was substantially completed. And so based on that, we shouldn't have to pay $6 million when the work was basically done, except for one or two punch list items. They can also say that there's been some kind of material alteration of the original agreement. And that's something that Dave is going to talk about in a few minutes. But the issue there is, if the county starts imposing higher requirements and different specifications deep into the process that increases the cost of the project, what you're doing essentially is increasing the liability for the surety. So if the project doesn't succeed and the surety has to be brought into the project, they can say, look, we bonded for $6 million. What they're asking for is actually $8 million worth of work. So they've materially altered this project, and on that basis, we're going to deny. They also can defend and say there's been some kind of overpayment or improper payment, or also termination for convenience and release of the principal. So on the state of the bond market, generally developers these days, as you're aware, don't have a lot of cash reserves. And that's made it difficult for developers to get bonds. And they're increasingly relying on general contractors to obtain the bonds. And the reason for that is general contractors have a much different balance sheet. If you look at the developer's balance sheet, they're very land rich and cash poor. But a general contractor is the opposite. They don't have a lot of land generally, but they do have lots of money flowing in and flowing out, and that's what surety companies like to see, that there's going to be some cash flow into the general contractor. So it's an increasingly difficult thing, especially for developers to get a bond. Now, if the developer and the general contractor can't get a bond, everything's not lost, and that's what brings me to the Utah law update. These are 2013 changes. This may be actually inside your packet, but these sections I would print out and send to your county attorney and make sure to circulate among those within the county that need to know about this. But one of the key changes is they've defined improvement completion assurance, which is basically the bond type issue, as a surety bond or letter of credit, cash, or other security. So in other words, if you want to guarantee that the work gets done, you don't necessarily have to require simply a performance bond. There are other options in Utah. The county could require a letter of credit from a developer or a general contractor, or cash, or other security. And other security could be an escrow agreement or collateral or something else. Other changes, the Utah Code has now provided limits on improvement warranties. So now, and I think this goes back to the gentleman earlier that said 1 year, now the law is no later than 1 year for these improvement warranties. So counties can't say, all right, you've got to warrant this work for 5 years. now no later than 1 year. And the amount that can be bonded for that is only up to 10%, no more than that. Now, so we've talked about some of the issues involved with performance bonds, and I want you to be aware that there are these alternatives in Utah now to performance bonds. And I'm going to turn the time over to David at this point, and he can talk about that. And again, if you have any questions about the finance side of things, here would be a good time to ask David those questions.
Thanks, Tyler. Being in real estate lending, I've done a lot of development loans, both commercial and residential, and I've seen a lot of the challenges that come along. Most projects typically go well, get completed, and happen in a proper manner. Typically, the projects that don't go well, in my experience, has been those with inexperienced developers or undercapitalized developers. And you all probably seen a little bit of both of those instances. Your larger developers will generally have resources and cash available to them. And therefore, they're able to post and get surety bonds to cover and guarantee the development. I think the biggest challenge too happens with those smaller developers that are undercapitalized and have little amount of money. And typically they're coming to people like me and asking for loans to complete the improvements. And we go through and we underwrite those and we take specific actions in due diligence and making sure that the project will happen as planned. We underwrite not only the developer, but also the contractor that will be doing the work, and making sure that the developer has enough funds available to them to complete the work. Because our goal is similar to yours. The last thing we want to do is to have a project that doesn't get completed or a project that is done improperly. So we take certain measures with those. In covering your selves in this, most counties and cities will take cash if they're unable to. But for most small developers, that's not possible. They're borrowing for that money, and they don't have the resources in addition to post for their cash bond. Otherwise, they would just do that and then take the periodic releases from you. The next option for them that many cities and counties ask for is a letter of credit. Every financial institution is going to be a little different in how they handle letters of credit. We at Bank of Utah typically underwrite them very stringently because they are a very open-ended instrument. You can call on them at any time, and we require them to be backed by cash in our instances. So they get back to the same problem of needing cash again. So the instrument we deal probably the most in are escrow agreements with cities and counties. And we see all kinds of them, from very sophisticated to very rudimentary. But I think the important thing in escrow agreements is to be very specific and succinct in your requirements, that your releases will come on county letterhead. and have that stated in the agreement. Have a very succinct process for the authorization of releases. The other thing is, at least from our standpoint as a bank, we do not like to have language in there, and I don't think it's done intentionally, is sometimes when the agreement is written up, they try and pull through not necessarily direct language, but closely direct language to make the bank almost a partner of the development agreement. We only want to act as the holder of money, and will act at your request. We will send it to where you want to send it, we'll disperse what you want us to disperse according to whatever instructions you give us. But we don't want responsibilities regarding the inspection of the improvements, or any language regarding whether the improvements were installed correctly. We will only act as you direct us. We get into these by way of loans on developments, and then we also get into them by way of a developer will come with cash and he'll say, I want you to control the cash. I don't want to give it to the city or the county. I'll give it to you, and we'll enter into this escrow agreement. And so sometimes we have a loan on in these instances, and sometimes we don't. We will charge a fee for our services to act as an escrow agent for the developer to get those completed. One thing, yes.
Yes, going back to your comment about letters of credit, how often, or does it happen when there's an alleged default by the developer? Is the government able to get the money just on demand, if that's provided in the agreement, or is there frequently a fight about getting that money released? And if so, what's the fight about?
The letter of credit will, and the letter of credit agreement will outline how demand is made, and it varies from situation to situation, but typically upon demand, the financial institution will pay the money guaranteed under the letter of credit. And typically, in our case, that will be backed by cash in most cases. So we will release that and release the letter of credit money to you. The other thing about escrow agreements is, and I think I touched on this earlier, make sure that your release provisions are clearly outlined in that, and how periodic payments will be made. I had an instance with one developer. We entered into the escrow agreement, and they went in, laid sewer lines and water lines, and had it inspected by the city, came back, and they signed off on it. The developer petitioned a release from the city under their escrow agreement, and the city said, well, we will not release anything until all improvements are complete. Well, it left the developer in a very tough spot because his cash was tied up under his loan, and he could not pay his respective subs and suppliers. The other thing about your agreements, and this happened just before 2007 with a lot of cities, is they had escrow agreements, and the language said that funds will be either placed in an account or available as undispersed funds of a loan. And as long as things are going well, that's all fine. What happened is a lot of banks that had written these agreements and entered into them with cities and counties ended up failing. And then you have FDIC come in and shut the bank down. And they come in and take over those assets, and they say, okay, no future advances will be made under these loans. Well, the city or the county is depending on those funds for the completion of the development. If that developer was in trouble at the time, the takeover of the bank happened, a lot of those got canceled, a lot of escrow agreements were left out. So the thing to put into your language is that the funds will be deposited in a controlled account. The things that we do and the practices that we have is we take and we disperse the funds off of that developer's loan and put them in a bank-controlled account. And they are sitting there for that escrow agreement to back that escrow agreement. So that you know funds are sitting in an account there available for you and can be released upon your demand, either back to you or out to a sub or a supplier. And I think that is the best way to protect yourselves with that. Developers aren't particularly enamored by that because they begin paying interest on those funds, even though once they've been drawn on their loan, they begin paying interest on that. But that's the safest way for a city or a county is to make sure that they are in a depository account and not relying on undispersed funds. A little bit of background of some things that I've gained through experience in working through problem situations is making sure that you know who the general contractor is, that is somebody who's in from the beginning, in your planning meetings, your pre-construction meetings, and you know, you've done a little homework on the developer, you know a little bit about his abilities to fund the improvements. If there is a lender, I'd probably be asking who the lender is, and making sure it's a lender that's really going to be able to happen for that individual, that they're going to get the financing they need. And then if it's a bonding company, doing a little bit of due diligence and analysis on that bonding company and their standing. We talked about establishing the partial release. Is there anybody here that allows improvements to begin without having the plat recorded? A lot of cities and towns do that, and because at that point of recording the plat, at that point you have responsibility for that development. One instance, we have a very good developer and a good general contractor. To alleviate the problems of bonding and or escrow agreements, the developer wanted his subdivision completed very quickly. And the contractor wanted to obtain the work to do the site improvements. They entered into an agreement that the contractor would go in and complete all of the improvements within 90 days of the subdivision, and that no payment would be due within the first 90 days. And then, once the improvements were in, then he would go and approach the city or the county at that time and record his plat. And that went well. In that instance, both parties, and primarily the contractor, was well-heeled enough that they were able to float all of the cost of those improvements. It benefited the developer because he knew that the contractor would move quickly to get it all completed within 90 days. We don't require the plats to be recorded when improvements begin, but we do want to make sure that the improvements are going in correctly. We like to have, if possible, you share with us your inspection reports that your inspectors are obtaining out on the site. As a lender, we'd like to know that your folks have gone out and looked at them, that the sewer is running downhill, and that the improvements are being put in correctly. Changes are always interesting. I had one instance, the development was spec'd, engineered, city signed off on the engineering, improvements were beginning, and they laid the water lines in, and they go for inspection, and the guy from the water department comes out and says, you gotta change out those valves. And the developer says, well, why? That's what you spec. And he says, no, I want this other valve put in. And he says, well, that's not on your specs. He says, well, I'm not gonna sign off onto it until you do that. So try to avoid the changes. That valve costs 3 times more than what the original valve costs. Those are the kinds of things that drive lenders and developers crazy. But we try and build into our costs with the developers some contingency, because always there will be things that will arise and there will be changes. But try to avoid the changes as much as possible and make sure your engineering is correct. Another instance, it was a townhome development that was going out onto a main road. They engineered the approach to that townhome development with 2 layers of concrete, 9 inches at the base, and then another 9 inches to be poured on, again with a skirt of about 10 or 15 feet. It was plenty over-engineered. They are in the process of pouring the second layer, and the inspector comes out and says, you need to have this rebar, different rebar in there. And the contractor says, well, that's not what's on our spec sheet. Our spec sheet, he has it there. And the inspector says, well, that's fine, but I won't sign off on it until you do that. That's another additional cost that is not there. And if costs are going in on the front end and there are cost overruns, that can jeopardize the overall completion of the project. When Tyler touched on this a little bit, when you do run into problems, reach out to the general contractor and the developer and enter it in a dialogue as soon as possible. You know there's a lender on the project, call the lender and say, I understand you are lending against this project. Here's some problems that we see and you might be interested in. or we have filed a stop work order for whatever reason. We would like to get together with you and your developer and the general contractor and meet and talk about these things. All of those things are very helpful. As a lender, we want to know as early as possible if the city or the county is having problems or issues. Because our goal is a lot like yours. We want to see that the lots are completed, that there's a viable subdivision there, that all the improvements were installed properly, because our source of repayment is the sale of those lots. And if they're not completed and ready to receive building permits, then we have no source of repayment. Is there any other questions anybody has for either myself or Tyler?
Do you ever see counties or cities require laws requiring this
Oh, such as a clubhouse or, no. The only thing I have seen on that is a landscaping requirement. Any other questions for us?
What about if just the entire subdivision is private?
Still, I have seen a bond or an escrow requirement for those. Because I believe the justification was the city is providing infrastructure, water, sewer into that development, and they're hooking into the city's sewer and water, the requirement required. Anyone else? Anything for Tyler on performance bonds? Okay.
David, I actually do. Tyler suggested writing your own form as a bond, and I know I tried to do that in the 90s with a group of counties, and the answer I got back from the Surety Association of America was, we write our forms. We're not just going to take somebody else's form and be surety for it. Is that, have you run into that problem, or have they loosened up in the soft market to signing on to forms that you write?
You may get that response. What I've seen, at least in one situation where they require the AIA form to be used, the county turned around and said that's fine, we can use that form, but we also need you to sign this other form. And so there were parallel bonds that were issued essentially. But you may run into that. But if you can get them to sign a custom form that's separate and in addition to the AIA form, that would give you the most protection in terms of the statute of limitations. But I mean, you may get that response if you present your form. They may say, "Sorry, we won't sign anything other than AIA." But at that point, you've got to evaluate what you want to do, and then just make sure you know what you're dealing with.
Thank you.